You know what haunts me the most? It's not the explosions. It's not even the blood, though God knows I've seen enough of that to fill a river. What haunts me is the silence right before everything went wrong. That perfect, beautiful silence when we touched down, and I thought, just for a second, that this was going to be a clean pickup. 30 seconds. Get in, grab the wounded, get out. Routine. That's what I told myself as the skids kissed the ground. Routine. But there's no such thing as routine in a war zone. I learned that lesson 53 years ago in a rice paddy in Vietnam, and I'm still paying for it every night when I close my eyes. I can still feel the vibration of the Huey's rotors in my bones. Even now, sitting here in this quiet room with my coffee getting cold, I can feel it. That thump, thump, thump that became my heartbeat for 13 months. Some guys came home and couldn't stand helicopters. Me? I couldn't stand the silence. The silence meant something was wrong. The silence meant death was close. My name doesn't matter. Not really. What matters is what happened on April 19th, 1969, in a place that doesn't exist on any tourist map. What matters is that 3 good men died trying to save one, and I've spent half a century wondering if the math made sense. 3 for 1. That's the trade we made. And the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing I've never told my wife or my kids or anyone until right now, is that I'm not sure it was worth it. There, I said it. 50 years of carrying that around, and I finally said it out loud. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Let me tell you how a kid from Ohio ended up flying a helicopter into hell. I grew up in a small town outside of Cleveland, the kind of place where everybody knew your business and your parents before you were even born. My father worked at the steel mill, came home every night smelling like fire and metal. My mother made the best apple pie in 3 counties. And I'm not just saying that because she's my mother. I'm saying it because it's the truth. Friday nights were for football, Sunday mornings were for church, and the future was something you didn't worry about because it was already written. You'd graduate high school, maybe go to college if your grades were good enough, or you'd follow your old man into the mill. Either way, you'd marry a local girl, have some kids, and die in the same town where you were born. That was the plan anyway. Then 1967 happened. I was 19 years old, working part-time at my uncle's gas station and taking classes at the community college. Not because I loved learning, mind you, but because my mother insisted. She said education was the key to everything. She was right in a way. Education kept a lot of guys out of Vietnam, but my grades weren't good enough for a deferment, and when that letter came in the mail, the one that started with "Greetings from the President of the United States," I knew my life was about to change. I remember my mother crying. I remember my father getting real quiet, which was worse than the crying because my old man was never quiet. He'd served in Korea, never talked about it much, but I caught him that night, sitting alone in the garage with a bottle of Jim Beam, just staring at the wall. He didn't say anything when I walked in. He just poured me a glass and slid it across the workbench. That was the first time we ever drank together. It was also the last real conversation we had before I shipped out, and we didn't exchange a single word. Basic training was at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and let me tell you something about Louisiana in the summer. It's not hot. Hot is what you feel when you leave your car windows up on a sunny day. Louisiana in July is like being smothered by a wet blanket that someone set on fire. The humidity was so thick you could chew it. Guys from up north like me, we thought we were going to die just from the weather. Little did we know that the weather was just practice for what was coming. I wasn't supposed to be a pilot. That wasn't in the cards for a kid with my background. But somewhere during those first few weeks of getting screamed at and crawling through mud, somebody noticed that I had steady hands and decent reflexes. They pulled me aside, asked if I had ever thought about flying. I hadn't, not really, but the alternative was humping through the jungle with a rifle. And even at 19, I was smart enough to know that a helicopter seemed safer than the ground. I was wrong about that, too. Dust-off pilots had one of the highest casualty rates in the entire war, but nobody told me that during recruitment. They told me I'd be saving lives. They told me I'd be a hero. They told me the birds were fast and nimble and hard to hit. What they didn't tell me was that we'd be flying into the worst possible situations, hovering like sitting ducks while guys on the ground shot at us from every direction. They didn't tell me that the enemy specifically targeted medical helicopters because they knew it demoralized our troops. They didn't tell me that the big red crosses on our birds might as well have been bullseyes. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. That's the thing about memory. It doesn't move in a straight line. It jumps around like a frog on a hot skillet, and you just have to follow it where it goes. Flight school was at Fort Walters, Texas, then Fort Rucker, Alabama. 9 months of learning to control a machine that wanted to kill you, even without enemy fire. The Huey, the UH-1 Iroquois, that was our bird. Officially, it was a utility helicopter. Unofficially, it was everything. Troop transport, gunship, supply carrier, and for us dust-off guys, it was an ambulance with rotors. I loved that machine. I know that sounds strange, loving a collection of metal and wires and hydraulic fluid, but there was something about the Huey that got into your blood. The way it sounded, that distinctive whop, whop, whop that you could hear from miles away. The way it vibrated through your entire body when you pushed it hard. The way it responded to your touch, light and sensitive like a good horse. I spent so many hours in that cockpit that it became part of me. I could feel when something was wrong with the engine the same way you can feel when something's wrong with your own body. A slight hesitation, a tiny wobble, a change in pitch. The Huey talked to you if you knew how to listen, and I listened. That's probably why I'm still alive. I arrived in Vietnam in March of 1969, Cam Ranh Bay. When that door opened and that wall of heat hit me, I thought there had to be some mistake. This couldn't be real. The air smelled like jet fuel and fish sauce and something else, something underneath that I couldn't identify until weeks later. It was decay. Everything in that country was either growing or rotting, and usually both at the same time. They bussed us to the processing center, and I remember looking out the window at this alien landscape. Rice paddies stretching to the horizon. Water buffalo standing in the mud like they'd been there since the beginning of time. Kids running alongside the bus, shouting things I couldn't understand, their hands outstretched, and soldiers everywhere. But they didn't look like the soldiers from the recruitment posters. They looked tired. They looked old, even the young ones. They looked at us new guys with this expression I didn't understand at the time. Pity, maybe, or envy. Envy that we still had all our illusions intact. Those illusions lasted about a week. I was assigned to the 54th Medical Detachment operating out of a base near Chu Lai. We called ourselves the Dust-Off Crews because of our call sign. That's where the name came from, just a radio call sign. But it became something more. It became an identity. When you said you were Dust-Off, people knew what that meant. It meant you flew into places that sane people avoided. It meant you saved lives. It also meant you were a little bit crazy. Our crew was 4 guys. Me, as the aircraft commander, that's the pilot in charge. Then there was my co-pilot, a kid from Texas named Williams, who couldn't have been more than 20, but flew like he'd been born in a cockpit. Our crew chief was a guy we called Mac, short for something Polish I never learned to pronounce. And our medic was a man named Thomas Jefferson Brown. And yes, that was his real name, and yes, he'd heard every joke about it. We called him TJ. TJ was the heart of our crew. He was from Mississippi, spoke with this slow drawl that made everything sound calm even when the world was falling apart. He'd been a paramedic back home, worked the night shift in Jackson, so he'd seen plenty of trauma before he ever got to Vietnam. But nothing, he told me once, nothing could prepare you for the injuries in a war zone. The things that bullets and shrapnel and booby traps could do to a human body. He said medical textbooks should include a chapter on war wounds, but they never would, because no civilian could handle looking at the pictures. TJ taught me more about emergency medicine than any Army manual ever could. On a dust-off mission, the pilot and crew chief were also part of the medical team. We all had basic training, but TJ took it further. He showed us how to apply a tourniquet in the dark by feel alone. He taught us the signs of shock, the color changes in the skin, the way the eyes got glassy. He drilled into us the importance of keeping the airway clear, how a man could survive a bullet wound but choke to death on his own blood if you didn't position him right. I spent a lot of time with TJ, more than anyone else on the crew, really. There was something about him that made you feel safe, which is absurd when you think about it because we were in a war zone and nobody was safe. But TJ had this presence, this calm, like he'd already made peace with whatever was going to happen, so he didn't need to be afraid anymore. I asked him once how he stayed so calm. We were sitting in the ready room, waiting for a call that we hoped wouldn't come, playing cards and drinking warm beer. He looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Fear is just your body trying to keep you alive. It's not your enemy. It's your friend. You just have to learn to work with it instead of against it." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I do now. The days in Vietnam had a rhythm to them. You'd wake up before dawn, usually because the heat made sleeping past sunrise impossible. Breakfast in the mess hall, which was powdered eggs and coffee that tasted like motor oil. Then you'd check the bird, run through the pre-flight inspection like your life depended on it, because it did. Every bolt, every wire, every drop of hydraulic fluid. Mac was obsessive about maintenance, and I loved him for it. He'd crawl around that helicopter like a mother hen, clucking and muttering about anything that wasn't absolutely perfect. Then you'd wait. That was the hardest part, the waiting. You'd sit in the ready room or outside in the shade if you could find any, and you'd wait for the radio to crackle. Sometimes it was quiet for hours. Sometimes the calls came one after another, so fast you barely had time to refuel between missions. You never knew. That uncertainty, that constant state of almost action, it wore on you. Some guys played cards. Some guys wrote letters. Some guys just stared at the wall, lost in their own heads. I learned to read. Sounds strange, I know. a guy in a war zone reading paperback novels, but it was the only thing that could take me out of that place. Westerns, mostly. Louis L'Amour. Something about those stories of cowboys and gunfights in wide open spaces. It felt clean, simple. Good guys and bad guys. Right and wrong. Everything that Vietnam wasn't. When the call came, everything changed. You'd hear that crackle on the radio, the words, dust off, and your whole body would shift into a different gear. Heart rate up, senses sharpened, every bit of training kicked in, and you were running for the bird before you even consciously decided to move. We had a goal of getting airborne within 3 minutes of a call. Most times, we beat that. In the air, I felt different. On the ground, I was scared half the time, jumping at shadows, always waiting for something bad to happen. But in the cockpit, with my hands on the controls and that engine roaring above my head, I felt in control. It was an illusion, I know that now. A bullet doesn't care how good a pilot you are, but the illusion was enough to get me through. We'd fly low, following the terrain, using the trees and ridges as cover. The Huey wasn't fast, maybe 120 knots if you pushed it, but it was maneuverable. You could duck and weave through valleys, pop up over ridgelines, use the landscape to hide your approach. The enemy had radar, but it was unreliable, and they had a lot of guys with guns who didn't need radar. They just needed to hear you coming and point upward. I got shot at on my third mission. Just a single round. Came through the floor and lodged in the ceiling above my head. I didn't even realize it happened until we landed and Mac showed me the holes. Entry and exit, about 6 inches from my left ear. If I'd been leaning over to check an instrument, if I'd shifted in my seat at the wrong moment, well, there wouldn't be an old man sitting here telling you this story. After that, I stopped thinking about the bullets. Couldn't afford to. If you thought about every round flying at you, you'd freeze up, and freezing up got people killed. Instead, you focused on the mission. Get in, get the wounded, get out. Simple, mechanical. Let your training take over, and don't think about the what-ifs. It worked, mostly. April was bad. The monsoon season was winding down, which meant more operations, which meant more casualties, which meant more calls. There were days when we flew 6, 7, 8 missions. By the end of it, you were running on nothing but adrenaline and coffee. You'd land, help load the wounded, take off again, and by the time you got back to base, you couldn't remember half of what you'd done. It all blurred together into a single endless loop of rotors and blood and radio chatter. The 19th started like any other day. I woke up around 5, stared at the ceiling for a while, then dragged myself to the mess hall. Breakfast was the same as always. Powdered eggs, coffee, toast that was somehow both burned and soggy. Williams was already there, reading a letter from his girlfriend back in Amarillo. He'd read that letter about 1,000 times already, but every morning he'd unfold it and go through it again, word by word, like he was looking for some hidden message he'd missed. We were on standby, which meant we had to be ready to go at a moment's notice. I spent the morning playing solitaire and trying not to think about the heat, which was already approaching unbearable. By noon, we'd had 2 calls, both relatively clean pickups. Wounded guys from a firefight near the river. We got them out, dropped them at the field hospital, and headed back. It was almost 4 in the afternoon when the 3rd call came. The radio operator's voice was tighter than usual. I noticed that right away. When you've been doing this long enough, You learn to read the small signals, the hesitations, the tone, the words they choose. This one was bad. Dust off 9-2. We have one critical, urgent medevac. Grid coordinates to follow. Be advised, hot LZ. Enemy contact ongoing. One critical, urgent. That was the highest priority. It meant someone was dying, would be dead if we didn't get there fast. Hot LZ meant they were still fighting. Enemy contact ongoing meant we were flying into the middle of a battle. I looked at Williams. He was already strapping in, his face set in that blank expression we all wore when things got serious. Mac was running his final checks, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, and TJ was in the back, organizing his medical supplies, his lips moving in what I eventually realized was a prayer. I didn't pray. I don't know why. Maybe I felt like I had no right to ask for help from a God I'd been ignoring. Or maybe I was afraid that if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. The flight out was tense, but routine. We followed a river valley, staying low, trying to minimize our exposure. I could see the smoke before we saw the LZ, a thick black column rising from a tree line. That usually meant a vehicle hit. Maybe a mine or an RPG. The wounded soldier was a tanker, I found out later. His M48 had rolled over something that shouldn't have been there. The radio chattered constantly. I could hear the ground commander directing his men, the sharp pops of rifle fire in the background. He was trying to secure an LZ for us, a clear space where we could land. They'd picked a spot about 200 meters from the disabled tank, a flat section of rice paddy that looked clear. Looked clear. Those two words. I've replayed them in my head 1,000,000 times. We came in fast, flaring at the last second to bleed off speed. The skids touched down, and for just a moment everything was fine. I could see soldiers moving toward us, 4 of them carrying a stretcher. The wounded man was wrapped in bandages, his leg... Well, let's just say there wasn't much leg left below the knee. TJ was already out of the bird, running toward them. Mac was right behind him. That was standard procedure. Meet the incoming wounded, help with the transfer, get everyone back to the helicopter as fast as possible. Every second on the ground was a second you could get killed. I was watching the tree line, looking for muzzle flashes, when I heard it. A sound that still wakes me up at night. Not an explosion exactly, more like a thump. A deep, heavy thump that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. I turned and saw TJ falling. Just falling. Like someone had cut his strings. And then there was screaming and more thumping, and I realized what was happening. Mines. We'd landed in a minefield. The ground that looked clear, the flat section of rice paddy that the ground commander had chosen, it was seeded with anti-personnel mines. Buried just under the surface, invisible until you stepped on them. TJ was down. I could see him about 30 feet from the helicopter, not moving. Beyond him, one of the soldiers who'd been carrying the stretcher was screaming, clutching what was left of his leg. The wounded tanker had fallen off the stretcher and was lying in the mud, his bandages soaked with fresh blood. And Mac was between them, standing perfectly still, his face white as paper. I didn't think. That's what I tell myself now. I didn't think, I just acted. Training, instinct, whatever you want to call it. I started to unbuckle my harness, started to climb out of the cockpit to help them. Williams grabbed my arm. He looked at me with these wild eyes and said something I couldn't hear over the engine noise. I tried to pull away, but he held on. Finally, I saw his lips form the words, "You step off this bird, we all die." He was right. If I walked into that minefield, I'd be dead. And then who would fly the helicopter? Who would get the survivors out? Assuming there were survivors. So I sat there. I sat in my seat with my hands on the controls, and I watched the worst thing I've ever seen unfold in front of me. The first medic from the infantry squad was a guy named Patterson. I didn't know him before that day, and I only know his name because I looked it up later, after we got back, after everything was over. He saw TJ go down and ran to help, because that's what medics do. That's who they are. They run toward the screaming. He made it about 10 feet before the next mine went off. The sound was different this time, louder, closer. I felt the spray of dirt hit the windshield. When the dust cleared, Patterson was on the ground, and he wasn't moving either. There was a long moment when nobody moved. The soldiers who'd been carrying the stretcher were frozen, looking at their feet like the ground had suddenly become their enemy, which it had. Every step was a gamble now. Every inch of that rice paddy could be hiding death. The ground commander was screaming into his radio, calling for engineers, calling for mine detection equipment, calling for anything that could help. But there was no time. The wounded tanker was bleeding out. TJ was bleeding out. Patterson was bleeding out. Every second that passed, their chances were dropping. I watched another medic step forward. His name was Kowalski. He was 19 years old. He had a picture of his baby daughter in his helmet, I found out later. She was 6 months old, and he'd never held her. He was going to meet her when his tour was up, just 3 more weeks. He moved slowly, carefully, testing each step before putting his weight down. The soldiers watched him like they were watching a man walk a tightrope over an abyss. 30 feet, 20 feet, 15. He made it to TJ. I saw him kneel down, check for a pulse. Then he looked up at me, and even from that distance I could read his expression. TJ was gone. Kowalski didn't stop. He moved on toward Patterson. Another 5 feet, another 3. He was almost there when he stepped on the third mine. I don't want to describe what that looked like. I've spent 50 years trying to forget it, and I'm not going to undo all that work now. Let me just say this. Kowalski didn't scream. Maybe the blast killed him too fast, or maybe he just didn't have time. 3 men dead in less than 2 minutes. 3 men who were trying to help. 3 men who had families and hopes and dreams and futures that evaporated in a flash of fire and shrapnel, and I sat in my helicopter and watched. The ground commander made a decision, a terrible decision, but the only decision he could make. He ordered everyone to freeze, to not move, to wait for engineers who might take hours to arrive. But the tanker was dying. I could see him from my cockpit, could see his chest heaving, could see the pool of blood spreading beneath him. He had maybe minutes, not hours. And he was out there alone, too far from anyone to help, surrounded by invisible death. Mac moved. I don't know what made him do it. Maybe he couldn't stand watching anymore. Maybe he thought he could see a safe path. Maybe he just snapped. He started walking toward the tanker, slow and careful, testing each step like Kowalski had done. I wanted to scream at him to stop. I couldn't find my voice. He made it. Against all odds, against all reason, Mac made it to the tanker. He picked that man up, threw him over his shoulders in a fireman's carry, and started walking back. Every step was an eternity. Every step I expected to hear that thump again, expected to see another body fall. But he made it. He walked back through that minefield